But now the next speaker is coming, and our next speaker will be Kody Muncaster, they, them. Kody is a PhD candidate and part-time instructor of a queer trauma course in gender, sexuality, and women's studies at Western University, Canada. Their research interests include Buddhist hermeneutics, non-binary Buddhism, Buddhist spiritual care, trans health, HIV and AIDS, and queer suicide prevention. Their most recent work towards a queer Buddhist hermeneutics, reparative readings of queer and trans Buddhist histories, is forthcoming in 2022 in James Edmonds and David Valentine's anthology Beyond Worship. They will speak about queer trauma and the Trans-Sattva, non-binary, gender euphoria, and the Buddhist teaching on non-duality. And now I have first to change the co-hosts that you can share the screen. I hope I can do that. One moment. So, does it work? Are you, wait, yes, all right.
All right, hello everyone. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, okay, great.
Well, I see the PowerPoint program, but not the full screen. I don't know if that's correct.
Okay, yeah, that's good. Yeah, all right. So today I'm going to talk about queer trauma and the Trans-Sattva, non-binary, gender euphoria, and the Buddhist teachings on non-duality. So just by way of introduction, my goal with this presentation is to join trauma theory and non-binary worldviews and to develop a queer Buddhist hermeneutic. So hermeneutics means basically interpretation of religious texts. So we're going to go through stories of bodhisattvas and the sutras, and we're also going to discuss cross-dressing and in Yidam practice in Vajrayana Buddhism. And then just a little bit about me. In 2016, after many years of confusion and stress, Cornelius, could you please mute your mic?
Ooh.
Sorry about that. So in 2016, after years of confusion and distress over my gender identity, I was diagnosed with gender dysphoria by a physician who was trans himself. And his exact words were, I think you need to explore your ability to be gender expansive. And so that phrase, your ability, really made it feel like something empowering. And slowly I'm starting to see this as a gift of insight into the non-dual nature of gender in our world. And so just to begin, a note on labels and anachronisms. So anachronism means something belonging to another time period. Queer people have been, there have been attempts to erase queer people from history. And as Jose Munoz puts it, our existence is ephemeral. So it's very hard to trace in archival work. And often any time people discuss queers in history, it's met with harsh criticism because various identity labels may not have existed in a particular language or culture. And then at the same time, historians will even depict images of men kissing as good friends. So I'm using English labels from a contemporary context for the sake of simplicity and conversation, but I do acknowledge that these labels may not be exactly, they may not adequately describe the cultural nuances of gender and sexuality in the time periods and cultures I'm trying to look at. But we're just trying to approximate something in order to be able to see somebody like ourselves in history, because I don't know Pali and Sanskrit yet. The historical Buddha himself may also be understood through a queer lens. So there was a scholar who describes how Ananda, who I believe was the Buddha's attendant, has been depicted as having a romantic relationship in the Jataka tales, which are stories of the Buddha's past lives. The two are depicted in one of their past lives as deers cuddling, and in another, they're depicted as sons of Brahmin parents who refuse to marry women so that they can spend their lives with each other instead. So this is just to say that we have always existed and we will always exist. Next, I want to talk about the Vimalakirti Sutra. So I'm using scholar Eve Sedgwick's work on paranoid versus reparative reading practices. So she describes how throughout queer studies, we've typically engaged in something she calls paranoid reading, which is where we are looking for something to critique, to simplify it. So we're always on the hunt to find something problematic in everything that we read. And she says that's important. And we're also lacking a little bit of reparative reading, which also looks at some of the positive consequences of a text. So she would say perhaps we can have both, but we may need to balance it out by doing a little more reparative reading. So in the Vimalakirti Sutra, Shariputra asks the goddess why she does not transition from a female body to a male one. So this is probably due to Shariputra's misogynistic beliefs about women not being able to attain certain levels of spiritual attainment. And I definitely agree with that feminist interpretation. And I want to present a second possibility. So the goddess explains that although she's searched for her female form for 12 long years, she still hasn't found it. And then she uses her powers to transform Shariputra into a woman, and she takes Shariputra's old body. And then she asks Shariputra, why don't you transition to male? And Shariputra is obviously confused. And then the goddess says, the Buddha teaches that all phenomena are neither male nor female. And so obviously this highlights Shariputra's sexism. And it also highlights the possibility for a non-binary reading, and to see non-binary identities as having insight into emptiness. Next, I want to talk about the Devadatta chapter of the Lotus Sutra. So in this chapter, the Bodhisattva Manjushri is said to have approached Shariputra, stating that the 8-year-old daughter of a dragon king has attained Buddhahood. Shariputra claims this is not possible because he believes women cannot attain enlightenment. So when the Dragon King's daughter appears, she gifts a jewel to Shakyamuni Buddha and spontaneously transitions to male and then becomes a Buddha. So we can see that this demonstrates again Shariputra's sexism. And I don't want to just stop at there. I also want to add the additional possibility of this having of a trans reading of this text. Similarly, we see in Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara, he says, may all those in the world as women make progress becoming men. And so in the Lotus Sutra, we see the possibility of transition in this life, and in the Bodhicharyavatara by Shantideva, we see the possibility of transition in the next life as well. Now I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about queer trauma. So Anne Cvetkovich's work on queer trauma sees queer trauma as ubiquitous. So it's everywhere, it's hard to escape. She counters the medicalized discourse on PTSD and discusses how queer people often have daily exposure to trauma, and queer people form something she calls queer trauma cultures, which are communities that are informed by trauma and imbued with trauma, but also involve elements of caring and mourning and activism and compassion, which are concepts that are crucial to engaged Buddhism. I'm also really influenced by Clementine Morgan's work on the notion of queer trauma time, which argues that queer people living with trauma, we time travel, as she says. So we are traveling to the past when we are in flashback, and we are propelled to the future with our hypervigilance. I think that Tonglen can be an interesting thing to talk about in a trans context and in a trauma context. So in Tonglen meditation, we see a transcendence of the self-other binary, so another non-binary way of meditating in some ways. So we're inhaling a dark smoke of suffering and exhaling a light of compassion, which could be a rainbow light, the colors of the trans flag. I think that this meditation is queer in its counterintuitive nature. And we can develop a lot of trans bodhicitta because as trans and queer people, I think that we have the ability to tap into a particular kind of suffering that a lot of people feel because of gender, not just trans and queer people, but I think everybody suffers under the gender binary in different ways. In terms of deity yoga, we see this in Vajrayana Buddhism. So often the practitioner envisions themselves as a deity or a bodhisattva, regardless of their own gender and regardless of the gender of that bodhisattva or deity. And sometimes they even wear clothing or drag of the narrative of the neighboring gender. In Lama Palden Dromla's version of Tonglen, often people find Tonglen quite difficult because they're imagining taking on suffering. So Lama Droma suggests that we imagine ourselves as Chenrezig or Avalokiteshvara Kuan Yin, and then we're Chenrezig taking on that suffering. So this is also a form of deity yoga. And Lama Droma says that we have the option to pick whichever gender of Chenrezig we wish to take on, because Chenrezig is often depicted as male, female, or androgynous, and is sometimes honored as a trans or non-binary bodhisattva. Thubten Chodron describes a yoga method of Chenrezig using a visualization of them as male, and she states, sometimes when doing deity yoga, we have a hard time imagining ourselves as a male deity if we're women, or a female deity if we're men. It feels funny. We don't feel like me anymore. And that shows how much we grasp at our gender as part of our self-identity, whereas grasping at the inherent existence of our gender is innate ignorance. Developing a self-concept of what it means to be a certain gender is acquired. We learn it in this life. So I feel like she is kind of speaking to a cisgender audience, because trans people often have a lot of experience imagining ourselves as another gender than the one we were assigned at birth. But deity yoga could also function as an empathy building exercise for cis people. They'll never be able to truly replicate our experience, but perhaps they could get a little insight into it. In terms of transphobia and trauma, B. Schurer explains that Tibetan Buddhist understandings of gender include a soteriological androgyny, so a salvific understanding of the non-dual transcendence of gender that calls for the practitioner to develop a spiritual state beyond binary notions of gender, a state that they call metagenderism. We see this in deity yoga of Gampo Maning Nagpo, which is a Tibetan translation from Mahakala. The word Maning means neuter and is related to their existence outside the gender binary. So the gender expansive nature of this deity is honored as part of their power. So I have a quote that says, "It is because this deity is not definitively either male or female that they are able to accomplish the work of all Buddhas." So it's a very interesting thing for a non-binary perspective to consider. And it might be quite interesting for non-binary people to do yidam of this deity. Baker explains that all people who do deity practice with Mahakala must question and unpack and deconstruct their own sex gender, indeed all sex genders, though again, they're probably writing to a cisgender audience, because I think that non-binary people are quite familiar with that kind of thing. So often gender euphoria is talked about in a Western context as being the opposite psychological state as gender dysphoria. So gender euphoria is when we feel joy or congruence, and it's often talked about the mind's state in relation to how the physical body is perceived by others. But we can have perhaps a little Buddhist perspective on gender dysphoria by also experiencing gender euphoria through our own meditations. So somebody might experience gender euphoria by doing deity yoga of an arguably non-binary, for lack of a better word, a deity like Chenrezig or Gampo Maning Nagpo. So we could experience gender euphoria there, and we don't. We can change things about our bodies and our appearance and pronouns as well, but this is just another way of experiencing something really nice. Buckner calls gender dysphoria sustained trauma steeped in repetitive gendered remembrances, and says that Soto Zen just sitting meditation, along with some other concentrated meditations like shamatha, might exacerbate dysphoria due to their relationship with the body. So it may be that in this case, it's a good opportunity to train in self-compassion toward gender dysphoria, though we don't want people to force themselves into something that's like way too difficult. On the other hand, yidam practice on a trans or non-binary Buddhist deity or bodhisattva may present a euphoric alternative that could leave the practitioner feeling not only a sense of congruence and joy, but also a sense of belonging as a trans person in our religion. In the Aganya Sutta, it is said that at the beginning of this world's cyclic existence, there were no sexes or genders. These methods of categorization arose due to greed and desire. So this does not mean that we should treat trans people as if we are more full of greed or desire than anybody else, like cis people. Rather, it's a story about the creation of a dualistic system that does not work for a lot of people. And this story is about a time before gender, which sounds like a trans utopia to me as a non-binary person. Kate Bornstein wrote in the second edition of their book, My Gender Workbook, that everyone, including cis people, is in constant gender transition. So this could be a transition from girlhood to motherhood, from goth to prep, a transition that I certainly made as a former goth emo kid. I saw Bornstein give a talk in Halifax, Nova Scotia in 2016 titled Trans for the Fun of It. So they talked about how they're actually quite influenced by Tibetan Buddhism, by its wisdom, its compassion, and especially its distinction between the conventional and ultimate truths. And they applied that in the context of gender. They encouraged us to detach from our notions of gender. And I asked them, I said, the concept of gender has harmed a lot of people. At the same time, it has real meaning for people as well. So I asked them, do you think that we should get rid of gender. It's harmed a lot of non-binary people, but it's also very important for some binary trans people. What do we do? And they explain that in the first edition of their earlier work, they would have said, yes, we should transcend gender as a concept, but now they recognize it's not going away anytime soon. So we should play with it and have fun with it while it's here. So we can create our own transtopias in the here and now that are grounded in play and joy. I hope that this work contributes to a long line of future queer sattva and trans sattva work and activism, which is grounded in metta. So thank you so much for your time. I'm trying to publish this work. I've been working on it in the form of a book and in small articles. So if you are a publisher in the audience or watching this on YouTube, or if you know any leads, please send me an email to this email below, kody.muncaster@outlook.com. My name starts with a K, and I'll copy that email into the chat. Thank you so much.